Mic check, testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing microphone, testing audio.
Testing 1, 2,
Audio
3.
check for the court reporter.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. There's nothing, I don't think there's anything on this anywhere. I just. Testing 1, 2, 3, testing.
Testing audio check, testing.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Hold on.
Getting anything?
I just have a very little bit, but let me turn my gain way up. I mean, I'm going to blast my ears out. Go ahead again.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
I'm just getting a lot of static.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing.
No, I'm getting
Testing
a lot
1, 2, 3.
I'm not getting anything in my headphones.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing 1, 2, 3. It's your whole system. Your whole thing is bad. Okay, so all of yours. So all of yours is bad. So I'll just put this back in my bag here.
please, don't worry about it. No, please, we keep you waiting. Okay. The Rules Committee will come to order. You know, President Obama used to say that the freedoms guaranteed in America's founding documents may be self-evident, but they are not self-executing. His point was that self-governance takes a lot of work. You can't set it on autopilot. And the ultimate success of democracy in this country is in our hands. Our freedom is not something that can be taken for granted. And no freedom is more fundamental than our right to express ourselves at the ballot box and to know that the leaders of our country will respect the outcome of the election, win or lose. But we can no longer rely on custom and tradition alone to make sure that that happens. We all saw that in the immediate days after the 2020 presidential election. And I believe a vast majority of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, can agree that the current code that guides the counting of electoral votes, known as the Electoral Count Act, is severely outdated and vague. The Electoral Count Act's ambiguous, antiquated language allows for broad and sometimes dangerous interpretations that weaken our elections and threaten our very democracy. And that's why today we will consider H.R. 8873, the Presidential Election Reform Act. This bill makes 4 big changes to prevent any person or political party from overturning an election. First, we are clarifying the Vice President's role during the joint session of Congress is to certify the election results. The Vice President does not have the discretion to throw away Electoral College votes. Second, we are giving explicit constitutional grounds upon which members may object to a state's electoral votes. If members have a credible objection, our bill raises the threshold to object to 1/3 of each chamber in order to move forward with debate. Third, we are ensuring that Congress receives a single, accurate election certificate from each state by setting a deadline for governors to transmit lawful election results and authorizing candidates to obtain a federal court order requiring a state to transmit the lawful certificates. And finally, we are ensuring a state cannot change their election rules retroactively. And we are prohibiting state election officials from refusing to certify elections. You know, these are common sense reforms that will preserve the rule of law for all presidential elections moving forward. They merit broad support. Time is running out before the next presidential election, and we must take urgent action now to shore up the tenets of our election system and defend democracy. And I urge my colleagues to support this rule and vote yes on the bill when it comes to the House floor. Now let me turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments that he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with an apology to you for being late, and thank you yesterday for understanding I needed to be with our good mutual friend Roy Blunt while he had a building named in his honor at the NIH. And I regret missing the hearing, but that was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I appreciate your understanding. Today's hearing covers a single item, H.R. 8873, the Presidential Election Reform Act. This is the majority's proposal to reform the Electoral Count Act, which governs our joint session to count electoral votes for President and Vice President of the United States. After the attack on the Capitol building last January, there is bipartisan consensus that reforms to the Electoral Count Act are desirable. Common sense reforms, like an acknowledgement that the Vice President's role is ministerial in nature, could be the subject of bipartisan agreement. Unfortunately, today's bill goes significantly beyond that kind of consensus, or those kinds of consensus reforms that could be the subject of a bipartisan bill. Indeed, today's bill represents yet another attempt by the majority to federalize elections at the expense of states, which traditionally have control of their own election administration. Again and again and again this Congress, the majority has been pushing this same sort of solution, whether it was part of H.R. 1, the majority's wholesale federalization of the elections, or H.R. 8, the majority's partisan reforms to the Voting Rights Act, or today's bill. To make matters worse, there's been no process with this bill and no attempt at regular order. Indeed, the majority noticed this hearing without text even being available, and we only received text 24 hours ago. The committees of jurisdictions have held no markup on this bill, and no member of Congress has been able to offer any amendments. Once again, this House is being asked to take or leave a bill written behind closed doors. Mr. Chairman, given all the majority's righteous and high-minded talk over the last 2 years about how democracy itself is in peril, don't you think it would be better served to have operated through regular order with real member buy-in on a topic that is as important to the American people as this one? If you wanted to actually put forth a real bipartisan reforms to actually protect the democratic process, shouldn't this bill have gone through regular order? Shouldn't the committees of jurisdiction have held markups? Shouldn't all the members have had the opportunity to provide input and have their ideas considered? Don't we owe the American people that? Instead, we're getting what we've always gotten from this majority. This is another partisan bill designed to fit a political narrative. Today's bill will, I suspect, meet the same fate as all the other closed bills the majority has put forward this year, going nowhere and going there fast. Mr. Chairman, I've said this again and again and again in this Congress. At some point, the majority must decide whether they are here to make political points or if they are here to make law. With today's bill, they are once again telling the American people what really matters to this majority, making the political points to distract from their failures to govern. And that's a real shame, Mr. Chairman. This is a missed opportunity. It's the American people who will suffer the most from that mindset. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on the Presidential Election Reform Act, introduced by Chairperson Lofgren and on the Republican side, Congresswoman Cheney. So there is a bipartisan support for this bill. And Chairperson Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis, we're delighted that you are here to testify. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole, for this opportunity to testify on this bill, the Presidential Election Reform Act. I respectfully ask that the Rules Committee report an appropriate rule to govern consideration. Following the presidential election in 2020, the former president and his allies attempted to violate the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act of 1887 through a coordinated campaign to overturn the certified results of the 2020 election, which, in the words of a federal judge, constituted, quote, an action unprecedented in American history. For the first time in the history of our country, the transfer of presidential power in 2020 was marred by violence, specifically violence targeted at Congress proceeding to count the electoral votes. This bipartisan bill is a product of over 2 years of work with staff lawyers in the Committee on House Administration and the January 6th Select Committee. Partnering with Representative Liz Cheney, we made extensive consultation with bipartisan law professors, former judges, other experts. The committee also, Committee on House Administration, also released a staff report in January of 2020 on the Electoral Count Reform Act. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that that report be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Before I describe the bill, I want to be very clear that Congress, in revising the Electoral Count Act and related laws, in no way condones the actions of the former president and his allies. Indeed, Professor John Eastman openly admitted that his plan violated the Electoral Count Act, and the former president was told the same thing. I also want to thank my friend and colleague and the vice chair of the January 6th Select Committee, Liz Cheney. Her partnership, leadership, intelligence, and frankly, her courage have been invaluable in the Select Committee's work and to the development of this bill. The nation is better off thanks to her service, and for this, we all owe her a great deal of gratitude. Now, here's what the bill does. First and foremost, the bill reaffirms that the Vice President's authority at the electoral count is ministerial. The Vice President's authority has always been ministerial, and it will always be ministerial. But as we saw in 2020, the former president and his allies sought to unlawfully exploit the ECA to suggest otherwise. The bill also would enact new electoral counting rules for Congress. Previously, just a few members of each house were able to derail the proceedings with frivolous objections. That would no longer be the case. Under this bill, no objection will be heard unless 1/3 of each house supports it, and objections will only be permitted for a narrow set of constitutional issues, such as whether an elector voted for 2 candidates from the elector's state in violation of the 12th Amendment. Crucially, the bill also prevents state and local election subversion. Governors will be required to submit their state's lawful certificate of appointment, and federal courts will be empowered to force them to do so if they refuse. Other state and local election officials will be prohibited from willfully refusing to certify election results. Sadly, that's a prohibition that we believe is necessary to protect the integrity of future presidential elections. Finally, the bill will ensure that state legislatures cannot take back their appointment power if they don't like the results of the presidential election, as was suggested by the former president and his supporters. Those unlawful plans really strain credulity. State legislatures lack that authority, and this bill will ensure that presidential elections may occur only under state laws as they exist prior to Election Day, and the only instance in which voting may be extended is if a state experiences a widespread catastrophic event that could affect the outcome of the election, and then through a judicial proceeding. These reforms don't benefit either political party, and there's no way to know whether they would protect the election of a Democratic or a Republican president in the future, but they are important to make sure that it is the American voters who select our next president, not the Congress, not a disappointed governor. The voters themselves will choose the president. I would just like to note in terms of, and I did hear Mr. Cole's criticism, this is a bipartisan bill, and in putting this together, we did extensive research and reached out to some of the most respected conservative lawyers in the country. Judge Michael Ludig, who is a leading conservative legal expert who served in the Reagan administration and whom President George H.W. Bush appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, testified before the Select Committee that the Electoral Count Act, quote, is not only a work in progress for the country, but at this moment in history, an important work in progress that needs to take place. Judge Ludig was very generous with his time and played a very key role in helping us to be informed about some of the things that needed to be in the Reform Act to make sure that we protect our republic, but we also respect the role of states, which we do in this bill, and also have an appropriate role for the judiciary. So with this, I'd be happy to answer questions or make other comments as the hearing goes forward, but I'll be happy to yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'm now happy to yield to Ranking Member Davis.
I sense your joy, Mr. Chairman. I sincerely do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be here today. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole, and all the members on this committee. For the first time since 1887, Congress is looking to update the Electoral Count Act. It would be the first update to the ECA in Oh, you need me to repeat myself? I object. This better? Better? Just trying to be a little raspy for you, sir. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. This is the first update since 1887 that Congress is doing in regards to the Electoral Count Act. And it would be the first update in 135 years, and yet the proposal before us has been rushed through in a very highly partisan manner, as Mr. Cole mentioned in his opening comments. Now, in fact, Mr. Chair, your committee announced today's hearing before we were even allowed to see legislative text. Why rush such a significant piece of legislation when the next presidential certification won't happen for over 2 years? It's simple. The midterm elections are just weeks way, and Democrats in the 1-6 committee are desperately trying to talk about their favorite topic, and that is former President Trump. They aren't even trying to hide it. My colleagues, Liz Cheney and Chairperson Lofgren, both members of the 1-6 committee, teased their proposal over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal with an op-ed that was focused primarily on former President Trump. As someone who voted to certify Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president of the United States, and who recently lost a primary to a candidate that was endorsed by former President Trump, I really don't care what former President Trump thinks about processes. But this is not about one man. This is about making sure that this institution upholds a bipartisan approach to something as important as reforming the Electoral College Act. I believe what House Democrats and the 1-6 committee are doing is irresponsible, and I think they're wrong. They've allowed their dislike for President Trump to cloud their judgment and guide their actions, no matter the consequences to this institution or the Constitution that they claim to want to uphold. The Constitution is clear. States have the primary role in federal elections, with Congress, us, playing a secondary role. Yet some of the provisions in their proposal would trample on state sovereignty and grant Congress unprecedented authority to interpret state laws, opening the door, and I know some of my colleagues in the majority might like this, opening the door to mass litigation. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't make any updates to the ECA. I think both sides of the aisle agree some clarifications need to be made. I agree. No vice president, no matter who they are, should be able to choose who the next president is. But we can address the specific roles of the vice president and Congress in certifying elections. I say that because both sides of the aisle have a history of objecting to election results, including many prominent Democrats. For example, Hillary Clinton denied the results of the 2000 and 2016 presidential elections and believed there were legitimate questions regarding the integrity of the 2004 presidential election. President Joe Biden has previously claimed that Gore won the 2000 presidential election and agreed that Trump was, quote, an illegitimate president. Vice President Harris has previously agreed that President Trump was an, quote, illegitimate president and claimed that without voter suppression, Andrew Gillum would have won the 2018 Florida gubernatorial election. Stacey Abrams, a witness in front of our Committee on House Administration at one point, the current Georgia Democratic gubernatorial nominee, has claimed that she won the 2018 election for governor of her state and has yet to concede that election. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi praised then-Senator Barbara Boxer's objection to the certification of Ohio's electoral votes in the 2004 presidential election. Representative Benny Thompson, the chairman of both the Homeland Security and the January 6th committee, objected to the electoral votes from the state of Ohio for the 2004 presidential election. Finally, we can't forget that one of the authors of the bill, Chairperson Lofgren, tried to allow the process to begin to unseat Congresswoman Marionette Miller Meeks during the post-2020 election in Iowa's 2nd Congressional District by permitting the election contest here in the House, despite it being counted, recounted, and certified by a bipartisan board in the state of Iowa. Despite denial of election results on both sides of the aisle over the years, the ECA has worked. It was put to the test as recently as January 6th, and the House reconvened, all of us, and we certified Joe Biden as president that same night. We did our job. It worked. So we should not turn making necessary updates to the ECA into a partisan stunt. The Senate's bipartisan proposal was also introduced here in the House. Why isn't that our starting point? And why were there no markups or even consultation with Republicans like me on the Committee of Jurisdiction, House Administration? It's because the proposal before us today is really not a serious one. It's a messaging bill meant to make this November about former President Trump because the 1-6 committee can't come to an agreement on their purpose or their goal. I urge everyone on this committee to oppose this bill and instead work in a serious bipartisan manner to make the electoral count process better. not more political. And I appreciate the comments when it comes to bipartisanship from my colleague, Chairperson Lofgren. But it's very disappointing to have this bill called bipartisan when we saw Republican law professors booted from the advisory group that was mentioned before in testimony. They also didn't again start with a true bipartisan package that was negotiated and introduced in the Senate and in the House, and I certainly wish that would have been a place where we could have found some common ground. This process is entirely partisan. It's unfortunate. I began my service as ranking member of the Committee on House Administration with high hopes for bipartisanship and solutions. I end my service in a few months as the ranking member of this Committee on House Administration in one of the most partisan committees and one of the most partisan institutions in our House in my lifetime. And that is a disappointment. And with that, I yield back the balance of any time I have.
Here, you have unlimited time, so,
Then I bring myself back.
Look, I appreciate both of both of you testifying here today, but, and I'm gonna, Mr. Davis, we're gonna all miss you. But I have to just be honest with you. I think, listening to you, I think this is one of the reasons why people hate Washington, right? I mean, finger pointing, but you did this, or you did that, or you did this. And I think people want solutions and not finger pointing. And by the way, no matter what one thinks of the January 6th committee, and I think it's done an extraordinary job, I think the one thing that has become crystal clear is we came very, very close to losing this democracy. Very close. And I think there are thoughtful people on both sides of the aisle who want us, all across the country, who want us to do something. And I think they expect us to do this. So again, I appreciate both of you being here, and I'll yield to Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with your remarks about our good friend, Mr. Davis. I, too, will miss him. I don't think whether you're Democrat or Republican, any member commands more respect on both sides of the aisle than my friend from Illinois. He's been an extraordinary member and a very effective, good-natured but combative participant in the Rules Committee process. And you've brought a lot of valuable insight, and I will miss you very much, my friend, in this capacity, although I suspect we'll see you in other capacities going forward, and I look forward to that. You can be extraordinarily proud of your service here. Let me start with you, Mr. Davis. Did the Administration Committee hold any legislative hearings or a markup of H.R. 8873, and were you given the opportunity to provide input during the drafting of the legislation?
No, sir.
Mr. Davis, are you aware of any consultations with state election officials about the workability of the bill we're considering today?
No, sir.
And in July, a bipartisan group of senators introduced legislation to reform and modernize the Electoral Count Act. Do you believe there's a bipartisan appetite in the House to actually collaborate on a similar measure?
Well, clearly there's not. Otherwise, we would have used that as a starting point. That bill is a bill that, folks like me would have leaned towards supporting. I mean, I would have liked to have seen what amendments might have been put in this committee, but I think that would have been a better starting point. It would have been a message to the nation, too, that the majority cares about bipartisanship rather than messaging bills. They know this bill is not going to go through the Senate. It's not going to pass. And what are we going to do for this messaging bill? We're going to fight about it today. We're going to fight about it on the floor of the House. When you've got somebody like me who really understands that this institution needs to fix certain portions of itself. But at the same time, consultation matters. There's one thing that I figured out in my 10 years as being a member of Congress, that if we don't communicate on the front end of drafting legislation or drafting solutions and giving everyone buy-in, that we don't get them. And then they become just, and they become circus acts rather than true legislative processes. And this is one of those circus acts that's all about messaging, it's all about clicks, it's all about former President Trump, and it's all about the elections coming up in 50 days.
And in your opening statement, you touched on the, quote, real election subversion in this bill. Can you expand on those concerns?
I'm very concerned about some of the provisions in this bill, especially a provision that would allow objections, to the election processes after Election Day. These are some of the things that I think could lead to more, problems in what we're already seeing in this country from both sides. And it didn't just start this past presidential election cycle. There have been efforts, and it's been a bipartisan effort to delegitimize our electoral processes only because of short-term vision and short-term electoral gain. And that's unfortunate. And I listed many of those, not to do a he said, she said, and not to finger point, but to show that this process of delegitimizing our electoral process and our country, which I believe has the greatest, freest elections in the world, it's been delegitimized by both parties. I mean, I watched some of my colleagues object to President Trump's electoral victories in states that he clearly won on the floor of the House when we were going through the same process that we went through on January 6th, but back in January of 2017. And to say that this process just begun because some of our colleagues wanted to object, it's off base. And unfortunately, though, what it's led to has been hyper-partisanship here in this institution. And good bipartisan solutions, like utilizing the Senate bipartisan bill as a first step and getting consensus, which I think we could have got. I would have been predisposed to looking at that bill in a very positive fashion. Heck, I would have liked to have been consulted on the front end of this bill, and I probably would be offering much different testimony, and heck, I might not even be the person here offering testimony on our side. But I wasn't consulted. One thing I found during my time as the ranking member of House Administration, the majority's leadership and the leadership of the House Administration don't value my opinion as much as I thought they would.
It seems like every time that we've had an election bill in front of this committee, Democrats continue to try and take away powers granted to the states by the Constitution. Shouldn't be surprised this bill does the same. Could you please describe how this legislation impacts the appropriate powers and authority of the states granted by the Constitution?
It really tramples state law and state sovereignty, and it gives the power to Congress, the same institution where we've had multiple objections to presidential election results in individual states in a bipartisan fashion. Congress, under this bill, would be the one determining whether state laws are actually applicable. The Constitution, that pesky little document that has made our country the greatest country in the history of the world, it specifically gives states the rights and the authority to conduct elections. And unfortunately, we've also seen in this bill that, as my colleague Chairperson Lofgren mentioned, catastrophic events could lead to extending election day in states. Will Congress have that role once this bill is implemented and the legislative intent is interpreted by the executive branch? These are the types of questions that I think should have been answered in a bipartisan consultation, but we don't have that. And look, is there a Republican co-sponsor of this bill? Yes. Our former conference chair, Representative Cheney, is a co-sponsor. But come on. I mean, that's like me saying a bill's bipartisan because Jeff Van Drew used to be a Democrat. I mean, it's just not, it doesn't pass the laugh test, let alone the smell test. This is a partisan effort, and it's completely one-sided, and consulting with somebody who doesn't consult with the Republican conference anymore is not consulting in a bipartisan way. And these provisions, these two I just mentioned, these two, I believe, in the end, if implemented into law, would lead to a more faithless electorate in this country. It's provisions like these two that will allow litigation and the questions to overwhelm what many in this country just want to be election day. We want elections to be run on election day. We want elections results to come in the day of, not weeks later. We want a process that states can determine work best for them. Do I believe certain states have better electoral processes than others? You darn right I do. I do. And it's the state legislature's job to go fight to change their processes, not us. That's unconstitutional.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking both Representative Lofgren and Representative Liz Cheney for their work in bringing this bill to us. Just for clarification, did Representative Liz Cheney change voter registration? I'm sorry, did Representative Liz Cheney change her voter registration to another party? Oh, okay, because you compared her to Van Drew, and Van Drew actually changed his registration from Democrat to Republican.
I could name plenty of other Democrats, but I didn't want to hurt their electoral
I just want to make
chances.
sure that, we are comparing apples to apples, and that truth matters.
Truth does matter, Ms. Torres, and that's the problem. It's, Ms. Cheney, Liz Cheney, friend of mine,
Well,
was
I
glad to
don't
have her
want
as
to
a
get
member
into
of
a
our
debate
leadership
about
team, but
Liz
in the
Cheney,
end, she is
somebody that
not consulting with any of us.
It's my time. I do not want to debate you on Liz Cheney. She can defend herself, and that's not why we're here today. When we speak about that horrible event of January 6th and everything that has led up to it, the Select Committee has taken a lot of time in investigating, in following leads, in hearing testimony, lots of hours of testimony. And everything points, to one person and his allies. And that is what we're trying to address here. Democracy does matter. And I would argue that, this is not a prop. This was the reality. And this is not normal. Somebody hanging a noose from a gallows in front of the U.S. Capitol is not a prop. That wasn't just a statement. This was a threat to the Vice President of the United States, a Republican Vice President of the United States. He did not have the power then, and he does not have the power now, and the next Vice President, Kamala Harris, will not have that power to choose the next President of the United States. That is not their role. Their role is a ceremonial one. That is why so many of us were dressed up that day, because we took our job seriously. And, to say Hillary Clinton, objected to that, maybe she objected to it, but she was present on Inauguration Day. And I know that she was present for Donald Trump because I was present for Donald Trump, because that peaceful transfer of powers really means something to some of us. Obviously, not to all of us, because it's not about who I chose to vote for, who I want to be my president, but it is about who the people of the United States want to be governed by, who they choose as their leader. So, there were so many baseless lies that led to this. This is what this bill is trying to prevent. I hope that my colleagues, on both sides, you can't strip Ms. Cheney, from her very conservative views. She is who she is. She is a Republican member, an old Republican member. not the new Republican caucus that you have now, because that is why you kicked, not you specifically, but why the caucus kicked her out of that. So this bill clarifies a lot of things that apparently were not cleared to the former president of the United States and many of his allies. So I hope that you can find a grain of decency in all of us in how we move forward to defend our democracy. It's our democracy. It is not your democracy. It is our democracy. I would never want the next generation of members to ever find themselves the way I found myself, 45 minutes pinned down in the balcony, hearing a gunshot, seeing the smoke from the gas that was deployed, feces all over the walls, people acting as if this was a third world country. We have to defend the United States of America. And the Old Glory stands for something, and that is, our democracy. I know that you are there with us on this. Unless you want to say something back. No, we won't not silence you here. The chairman was very clear about that.
Hey, listen, the individuals who built that gallows on the grounds of this great Capitol complex should be punished to the furthest extent of the law. It doesn't matter if it was the vice president, if it was one of us. There were certain individuals in that group that would have done unimaginable things to any of us, regardless of who we are and regardless of what would have happened and how they cast their votes. It's wrong. And I've said since day one they should be punished. I'm disappointed that we still have not gotten the right questions asked as to why the security posture in and around the Capitol was not at a better level when we now know the intelligence was much more precise and specific to Congress being under attack than we were led to believe leading up to and on January 6th. That needs to be addressed in a very bipartisan manner. And frankly, those are areas I hope the majority and minority, as I move on from this institution, still doesn't forget, and that they do ask those questions. Look, it is our democracy. This is not my democracy. I certainly wish the former president would have actually decided to be at the transition of power. But maybe that's why he doesn't like me, because I disagree with some of his actions. I don't know. You'd have to ask him. I'm not on his call list. But in the end, this bill, if we wanted to fix our democracy, there were better processes that we could have used to make our democracy better and utilizing better starting points. I have the utmost respect for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle of this institution. I wanted to come here and be an added voice to reforming the Electoral College Act, because I think it needs some reforms. I agree with you. No vice president, I don't care who it is, should feel like they can pick who the president of the United States is. That's why I voted differently than many of my colleagues, as did many Democrats vote differently than their colleagues in objections before to Republican candidates. But this unfortunately has provisions in it, Ms. Torres, that I just can't agree with, and I believe will lead to more election litigation. And that's the last thing we need in this country right now, at a time where we have too many Republicans and Democrats and Americans as a whole really disputing our electoral processes. And I'm going to continue to try and be a voice to change that, and a voice for Americans' confidence in elections.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to address some of the issues that have been raised, if I may. This bill has been the subject of bipartisan work among the January 6th select, both specifically myself and Ms. Cheney. When the January 6th Select Committee was established, one of the charges was to recommend legal changes that would prevent a January 6th event. So we have worked hard on that. I realize that The ranking member of the House Administration Committee has expressed his frustration. Frankly, I was sad when the minority leader withdrew his name from being on the January 6th committee. I think had he been able to remain on the committee, it would have been a strength. But that isn't what Mr. McCarthy decided to do. So we have a committee. It's bipartisan. We've worked hard. And many of the comments made by Mr. Davis, I think, are simply incorrect and I think need to be corrected. The Select Committee has had a lot of review of the Electoral College issue. We had multiple public hearings. We had 4.5 hours of hearings related to issues about the Electoral Count Act and the former president's efforts to overturn the election. During those hearings, we heard from 4 witnesses regarding the Electoral College votes and other issues related to the act and its imperfections, including, as I said earlier, Judge Michael Ludig, who has also been of tremendous help to Ms. Cheney and I in the drafting of the legislation. Greg Jacob, the chief counsel to the vice president, also testified extensively before the committee and going through the thorough research that he did on behalf of the vice president about the meaning of the 12th Amendment and what was really required, the proper role of the vice president. We heard from Rusty Bowers, the former Republican Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, and Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State for Georgia. We have also, the committee has engaged in litigation in the United States District Court for the Central District of California related to the Electoral Count Act. And that court concluded that the former president's attorney, Dr. John Eastman, and this is a direct quote from the opinion, conceded that his argument was contrary to consistent historical practice, would likely be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court, and violated the Electoral Count Act on several grounds. So the court concluded that if the country doesn't take appropriate action, quote, the court fears January 6th will repeat itself. Now, in looking at what to do, it's true. In the past, members, in not an organized way, randomly objected to electoral counts. I never did that, and it was more like a press release. My view is, you want to say something, send out a press release, don't make an objection. This act would prevent that from ever happening again, not only because it raises the threshold for objections, but also narrows the objections to only those in the 12th Amendment itself, which are rather limited. You can't have the president and vice president from the same state, for example. So that would never be able to happen in the future should this become law. I'd just like to note, in terms of some liberal measure, we met with Judge Ludig, Judge McConnell, Professor Bradley Smith, Professor Derek Muller, Professor Michael Morley. These are all leading conservative thinkers on constitutional issues and specifically the Electoral Count Act. I'll just note that this morning, the Cato Institute made this comment. They said that this bill, introduced by myself and Ms. Cheney, is, quote, more conservative and more originalist than the Senate bill. So this is, we think, a solid effort. If the House passes this, obviously the Senate bill is going to be marked up in Senate rules next week. And if there are differences, we will follow the legislative process. We'll have a conference committee to reconcile differences and to get a win for the American people. But this is very respectful of state law. It is not a federal overreach in any way, and it is necessary to protect us from those who would try and hijack the 12th Amendment in the future. So I thank the gentlelady for asking.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to associate myself with the comments of the ranking member, both his opening statement and statements made during his time of questions. Many of the questions that I had were answered. You know, it just strikes me that in all of the presidential elections of the 21st century, those won by Republicans are subject to some discussion or objection. In 2004, 2005, I was here. There was an objection. There was a Senate sustainer, and the vote came to the House to whether or not to sustain the objection or not. And there were 31 votes to sustain it. So look, I'm not going to read the entire list, but there are many people on this list whose names you would recognize. Mr. Thompson of Mississippi, Mr. Clyburn of South Carolina. So Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to ask that this list of sustainers from 2005 be made part of the record today, because I do think it is important that we do remember
Without
our
objection.
history. You know, I too, and Rodney, I do need to say, I'm sorry, Ranking Member Davis, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service on this committee. It is probably not the highest sought position to be the ranking member of the House Admin Committee.
It's so much fun.
And you've done a tremendous job, and we're grateful for your service, and we will miss you. There's no question about that. I guess if it's true what we're hearing, there will be action on a Senate bill. There'll be differences between the House and Senate bill. So the good news for you is you'll get to be on a conference committee as this is sorted out, and that gives me some comfort that you'll continue to be involved in that process, because I don't know of anyone who has studied this issue more than you have and been more careful in their study and more careful in their assessment. So we're grateful that you're there. We're grateful that you're continuing to work for your country, and we know, just like Mr. Cole said, whatever is next for you, I know there'll be great things. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. First, Mr. Davis, I had to deal with you on the floor earlier today. Now I got to deal with you in here. And I thought I was having a good day until I saw you earlier and now again. But thank you, and cheers to you, sir. Thank you for your service. Thanks for being a friend. Thanks for taking a lot of flack on this subject. For stances you've taken, I think, in the name of honesty, the rule of law, and truth, because we're down to those things at this point. And, Mr. Chairman, I missed the openings. I was in a meeting next door, and I apologize for that. And I'd like to pass and allow others to ask questions, because I may have some questions as we go forward on this. I think this is a terribly important piece of legislation that I would really want us to get right. And I appreciate my friend, Ms. Lofgren, for all the work you've done on this subject. This is not fun. This is, I said it to a group of people the other day that, you know, I worked hard on behalf of veterans and law enforcement because they put themselves in harm's way. And so now, which is just really a turn for the worse, do poll watchers and clerks and secretaries of state and electors. And we need to get this right, and so I thank you for working on this. I'm going to yield back to the chair and see if I can't pass for later on.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like the record to reflect I'm drinking polar water yet again.
So Polar is in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's the best seltzer that exists in the...
I knew.
Yeah.
I expect to tour the facility if I come to your district.
We will grant you a visa and you can come.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely.
Mr. Davis, thanks for being here today. I'm just going to ask you a very blunt question. Would this bill prevent an angry mob from attacking the Capitol in the future?
No, it wouldn't. And it's unfortunate. Look, again, what happened January 6th, all of us agree, should never, ever happen again in our nation's history. I don't care what type of mob it is. I don't care what political objection they're throwing forth as their grievance. They should be dealt with to the fullest extent of the law. That's what we should do. Look, there are many pieces of this bill, Mr. Rushenthaler, that I think can be very bipartisan. I mean, frankly, we ought to make sure that people are held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. I mean, somebody breaks into the Capitol, they broke the law. Make sure that they are prosecuted. Make sure they go to jail. Make sure they're held accountable. That's what our system's all about. But raising the threshold and clarifying the vice president's role, they're bipartisan ideas. Just introduce a bill that does that. I think you could pass it on suspension. I mean, we'd even probably have one of ours call for a roll call.
Yeah, and to that end, I mean, I was on the floor talking to members about this bill from our party, and it was amazing how many people told me they wish they could vote for this, but for all the extra that's in here. We can talk about some of that, but let's just talk about the definition of catastrophic event. I mean, if I were cheeky, I'd say a catastrophic event would be any time a Democrat is behind in the vote tally. But would you like to elaborate on the lack of definition for catastrophic event?
It's unfortunately typical of what we've seen in drafts of legislation in regards to electoral issues and bills like H.R. 1 last Congress and H.R. 1 this Congress. They will write the legislation and draft the text in a way that it leaves way too many questions open. And I think a lot of these issues, will, I don't know if it's purposeful, but one thing I found out too, as somebody who was managing campaigns and involved in politics even before I got elected to Congress, is that the majority Democrats and their legal allies on the outside, they're really good at electoral law. And we Republicans have got to be able to stand our ground with them in a court of law. It just seems to me the definition of a catastrophic event. What, COVID? I mean, we're still in a catastrophic emergency right now that now has proxy voting being the norm when it was supposed to be. I remember sitting in a larger committee room, the Ways and Means room, debating that proposal, and I said, once this emergency is over, this will still remain. And unfortunately, I was proven right. Is COVID response. Illinois is still under a COVID emergency, okay? Does that mean that they can extend election day to get the results that they want? Does that mean that decision can be made after the initial unofficial results are in on election night? These are the constitutional questions that I am extremely concerned about. And I respect the fact that Chairperson Lofgren and others sat down with some of the best legal minds in our nation. But why weren't we there? Why weren't we included? I mean, that to me is the biggest underlying question of this bill is to why not us? Why not Mr. Cole? If you didn't want me there, why not you? Why not you? Why not you?
One other concern I have is this 5-day issue where a candidate would have up to 1 day, a full day after the polls close, to then determine if there's grounds to extend voting for 5 days. Yeah. To me, that would undermine our faith in elections. It would actually do the opposite of what this bill purports to do and open up a myriad of issues. Would you like to talk about that?
Listen, that's what I mentioned earlier. This bill, unfortunately, does the opposite of creating more faith in our elections. I have worked and I introduced legislation. For those of you who have co-sponsored it here, thank you. It's the American Confidence in Election Act. And we sat down and we talked with election administrators. We talked with secretaries of state. We traveled the nation to really get ideas and really tout what's working in our election administration throughout this country. Look, my goal has been to actually move beyond the lack of faith that I've seen in a bipartisan fashion since I've been here. Remember, every Republican president in the 21st century, their electoral college results have been objected to. Did you not think that there might be some objections to the Democrat? In 2004, George W. Bush won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College by a large margin, yet still, we saw objections on the House floor. Granted, Granted, the process worked. And look, the process worked on January 6th, too. I was there. I was part of the process. I walked off the floor with the Vice President of the United States at 4:30 in the morning, the guy some of these folks wanted to hang, who had the courage to come back and do his job. Whether you agreed or disagreed with what he did and what everyone else did, we all represent our constituents. And your constituents were represented in objections of Republican presidents in the past, and constituents of our colleagues were going to be represented on January 6th. And unfortunately, we saw what happened that day with the Capitol under attack. There are other outside issues that this bill does not address when it comes to security and the posture and the politics involved in the security posture in this institution that need to change. And trust me, if I would have been on the 1-6 committee, those questions would have been asked. Those questions and those details would have been put to the forefront. I guarantee it wouldn't have been a made-for-TV production like some of the 1-6 hearings have been, but I would have asked them, and we would have gotten the answers that I still think this institution, this country needs.
Thanks, Ranking Member Davis. I appreciate it. I think yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You look very nice today, Mr. Ray.
Well, thank you, Mr. Davis. I appreciate that. That's
Yeah,
very
I like
kind of
that
you to
tie.
say. Thank you. I think I speak for both of us when I say that both of us will be eagerly awaiting the invitation from the chair to go to his district. So
I think I would have had a little more success over the last few years with some amendments if I would have known the polar water secret.
with that, I'll yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and I thank the gentleman for his free advertising for products made in my district. But he asked a question. He said, would this bill prevent any mob from attacking the Capitol? And I think it's worth pointing out that the mob that attacked the Capitol was led to believe that the Vice President of the United States or the Congress could overturn this election. The former occupant in the White House told them that. And so they came up here demanding that action. The violence of January 6th happened because the people here were encouraged to illegally attempt to overturn the election. Again, they were told that Congress had the authority. They were told that the Vice President had the authority. So it seems to me that clarifying that we do not have the authority, the Vice President can't do it, might in fact prevent future violent attacks on this Capitol. It would prevent bad actors from submitting fraudulent slates of electors that would give these people hope that somehow they could succeed. So, I actually think the opposite. I actually think this bill will go a long way to clarifying the reality for people who were deluded into believing that somehow they had a chance of overturning the will of the American people and overturning our democracy. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you, Ms. Lofgren, thank you, Mr. Davis, for your presentations today. I've got to start by laying my cards on the table, which is I don't believe in the Electoral College. I'm with Thomas Jefferson, who said it was an ink blot on the Constitution. I think it's a profoundly undemocratic practice and institution, the way that it's evolved over the centuries, like other anti-democratic institutions we've left behind, like the state legislatures choosing U.S. senators, something that we got rid of in the 17th Amendment, like the disenfranchisement of African Americans, of women, which we got rid of in the 15th and 19th Amendments. And the very first bill, Mr. Chairman, that I introduced as a member of the Maryland State Senate was for a national popular vote interstate compact. This is back in 2007, and Maryland became the first state to initiate this compact to say that we were forming a coalition of states that would attempt to get us out of this particular electoral college practice by agreeing to cast our electoral college votes for the winner of the national vote rather than the winner in our states. And we are more than halfway there now. I think we're nearly 2/3 of the way there with the states that have joined. I mean, what are the basic problems with the electoral college? Well, one is that it doesn't follow majority rule. So it's not the way we elect U.S. senators, representatives, mayors, governors, anybody else. In all of those other elections, the only question is who got the most votes. We spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year exporting U.S. democracy and elections abroad. And you know, one thing those foreign countries never come back to us with when they're writing a new constitution is, hey, that electoral college thing you've got, we'd really like to try that over here. Sounds like a great idea. We fail in exporting that anywhere. Nobody adopts that. And all of our constitutional development has been towards greater inclusion and majority rule as opposed to these antiquated and obsolete arrangements we have. The second problem with it is that it is profoundly polarizing and dividing for the country. If you're running for president on the Republican side, you're basically saying, how do I go out and make sure I can win the red states and a handful of purple states? If you're running on the Democratic side, you're saying, how can I hold the blue states and get a handful of purple states? And then it marginalizes the vast majority of the country because most people live in safe red states or safe blue states, and there's no campaigning there. There's no campaign offices set up in the general election. There's very few TV ads, if any. It's just not a wise deployment of your resources if you're a Democrat or a Republican to go spend time in California. Everyone knows it's going blue. It's not wise to go spend time in Mississippi or Alabama or Indiana or North Dakota or Rhode Island or Vermont or what have you. So the whole election comes down to a handful of states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Michigan. Everybody knows what they are. That's just an irrational way for the world's greatest democracy to conduct a presidential election. And recently we've seen, Mr. Chairman, that the Electoral College has become dangerous in promoting electoral mischief and corruption because if you can take just one state out, even if it's illegitimately, you could win the whole election as opposed to relying on a national popular vote, which almost inevitably has differences of millions of votes. And we saw in 2020 that the Electoral College has become a positive danger to us because there are so many nooks and crannies and phases in the process that if you have a strategic bad faith actor like Donald Trump, he will try to do whatever he can to turn each phase of the process into another opportunity to revisit the election and to essentially re-argue the election. So people were looking at January 6th as people voting for who they supported for president as opposed to just receiving the Electoral College votes that were brought in by the states. So I think that the imperative of democratic progress in America demands that we recognize that we've outgrown that system and that we can move to majority rule. And the national popular vote, interstate compact, I think is the best vehicle right now. I think if we did it that way once or twice, then we would quickly recognize that it's time to amend the Constitution. When the Constitution was adopted, there was no constitutional right to vote. Most people were disenfranchised in the country, and it was a time of very poor transportation networks and communication networks. So you needed this belabored, protracted process with all of these different steps. We don't need that anymore. We can do it the way we elect everybody else. You count the votes. Once the votes are counted, then you announce who the winner is. And so you don't have all of these different intervening stages. Now, having said all of that, I want to commend Ms. Lofgren and Ms. Cheney for doing a very good job of making the best possible rules for the Electoral College system that we've got. And I've studied it real carefully. I've studied the controversies and the conflicts that we've had before. And Ms. Lofgren, you clearly have addressed the biggest pitfalls of the current system. And I want to commend you for that. I want to praise you and Ms. Cheney for working in a very bipartisan and open-minded way to make the best of what is still, I think, a very rickety situation. Let me ask you a couple of questions. One is, one of the things that people are worried about is that a governor now who wants to perpetrate a big lie of any particular partisan stripe could simply refuse to produce the certificate of ascertainment embodying the will of the electors as expressed at the state legislature. What are your precautions against that happening? How are you going to prevent a governor from just taking a walk?
Well, it requires the governors to certify and transmit the election. Should a governor refuse to do that, a presidential candidate has the option to go to federal court and get injunctive relief. If the governor still refuses to transmit the certificate, the federal court has the capacity to order another elected official to transmit that certificate. So you couldn't get someone who said, well, I don't like the guy who won, I'm going to send a different set of electors. That couldn't happen under this bill. I want to address, if I could, very briefly as well, the issue on the catastrophic events. It is, some say there shouldn't be any provision for this, and that's a point of view. The Senate bill provides for an extension in a catastrophe, but doesn't define what that is. Leaves it up to states to define, and the concern is you could have a governor such as you've just described say, well, I just think there's voter fraud, so let's keep it open. In this bill, here's the definition. The catastrophic event has prevented a substantial portion of the state's electorate from casting a ballot on such day, or to be ballots already cast to be destroyed or rendered unreadable, the number of voters prevented from casting a ballot by such event, the number of ballots destroyed or rendered unreadable by such an event, or the total of both such numbers is sufficient to potentially affect the outcome. And then we specify what those catastrophes could be. It has to be a natural disaster. Well, first, act of terrorism, we define what that is. It has to be a natural disaster, looking for the, that includes historically significant floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, and the like.
Yeah.
And then it's not just a governor deciding that. You go to a judge, a federal judge has to make that determination.
And I appreciate that, because under the current law, there are not specific standards that define what a catastrophic
And
event
then there's
could
a
be.
limitation
It's
on
wide
how
open.
long it could last.
And in
just 5
general,
days.
and I think that's emblematic of what you, I think that's emblematic of what you've done, which is you've tried to lend a lot more precision and finiteness to
Page 3.
a series of concepts that I think have been way too wide open. The general question I have for you is just, to what extent do you think this solution, which I think we absolutely need to pass, is vulnerable to the Supreme Court proclaiming the so-called independent state legislature doctrine, and thereby arguing that some of the judicial relief that you've built in here, or some of the congressional standards you've built in here, are not somehow impinging on the authority of the legislatures to do whatever they want, which is essentially the claim of the ISL doctrine.
Well, that's a out there doctrine, as you know. There's no authority for it, and I would hope that the court would not do such a radical and unconstitutional decision. However, we, by statute, will define how this process works, and it is the governor that transmits. We freeze the state law has to be implemented as it exists on Election Day. It's based on the Article 2.
The powers of Congress. So we're exercising our
Article 2,
constitutional
Section
authority to
4,
draw
and it
lines. Yeah.
references the 12th Amendment.
Yeah.
So I think, you can never say never, but we have utilized the
Certainly not these
provisions
days.
in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, 12th Amendment, wrapped it up in a way that is could not be undercut unless somebody really just wanted to trash the
Yeah.
Constitution.
All right, great. Well, look, I just wanted to say one final thing about Mr. Davis's statement about bipartisanship and Ms. Cheney. Again, I've got to say that Ms. Cheney is someone I admire and respect very much, although I disagree with her on probably 95% of the public policy issues. I don't think it's within any one of our judgment to basically read someone else out of their political party. And that's why I think the comparison between Liz Cheney and Mr. Van Drew is inept, and I don't know if this is what Ms. Torres was getting at, but he actually left the Democratic Party and became a Republican, and probably to the great delight of both parties. I mean, he went to where he belonged, but Ms. Cheney considers herself a Republican. She was the chair of the House Republican Conference. She was the #3 elected Republican, amongst your members. She served alongside you in the GOP leadership, and she's not renounced any of her views about the Republican Party. And so, I know that in these very tough and polarizing days, people want to read other people out of their party. I assume that's what your opponent, who was endorsed by Donald Trump, did to you. If you did not sufficiently pass the pro-Trump litmus test, well, then, you're a rhino or whatever Donald Trump calls the people who don't follow exactly what he does. I just think that's a really unhealthy dynamic. Obviously, you're free to say that, but I don't think it's really fair to our colleague because she considers herself very much a Republican. And, there are those who say, oh, it's not a bipartisan committee, it's just Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger. They're both Republicans, and they're both passionate Republicans. And so they might disagree with you about whether there should be an investigation into January 6th. They might disagree with you about Donald Trump or whatever it might be. But I don't know. It strikes me as just a basic matter of collegial respect that we allow people to identify themselves with the party that they're registered to and they belong in. And I'm very happy to have you answer that.
Mr. Raskin, great to see you. Saw you on video earlier. I know people will probably call me a rhino even more, but I actually enjoy seeing you in person and debating you in our committee. Thankfully, I'm not on the 6 other committees you're on and I have to deal with you on a regular basis. In the end, you go back to my testimony. I'm not trying to erase anyone from the Republican Party. And again, I'll reiterate my point. Liz was a member of our leadership team. And there are many people that can tell you I supported her being a member of our leadership team, even amongst objections. But the facts are this. Liz chooses not to associate with our conference anymore and just utilizing the association to make this bill bipartisan without consulting others that I would have gladly been a participant in the drafting of this legislation. I would have gladly been a participant in the drafting of other election-related legislation. But again, the thing I found out about my time as ranking member, your majority doesn't value my opinion to put me in the room to be a part of that. So I don't have a chance. And look, as Chairperson Lofgren said, I would have loved to have been on the select committee. I would have gotten answers that have already been given to other bipartisan investigations about why the security briefing I got on January 5th was nowhere near what we saw, even though we now have seen the evidence that there were clear indications the Capitol would be under attack. I was not under that impression the day before until the day of when I saw it under the attack in the Sergeant at Arms office on the video screens. As we look ahead, to me, it was an historic precedent that was set by your majority when 2 members of our conference were not allowed to serve. That's never happened, and it sets a terrible precedent that unfortunately is going to impact your party when the parties change in power. And it was a message I sent at the time that these decisions have consequences long after we're all gone, and it creates more dysfunction in this institution. I accepted an appointment from our leader, who appoints Republicans. And my colleagues, Adam Kinzinger is a friend of mine, Liz is a friend of mine. I disagreed with their decision to accept the appointment from Speaker Pelosi. That again gives me the right to say, I wish I or some others in our conference would have been consulted on the front end of this. And I think this conversation would have been very different. And I don't want this discussion over an individual and me to overshadow our concerns with the lack of bipartisanship in this bill. And I think that's something that I wanted to make sure I clarified with you, sir. And the last thing I wanted to clarify, did a lot of your colleagues in the state Senate support you coming to Congress?
I did, well, on the Democratic side, I bet the Republicans supported me going to Congress, too.
I think they both wanted to get you out of here, and now we're stuck with you, man.
Yeah.
Hey, no, in all seriousness, I've enjoyed my time working
Well,
with you.
Mr. Davis, I got to say, you are a gentleman, and we're going to miss you, and I'm really sorry that things have ended up the way that they've ended up on us losing a number of great members of Congress, including you, including Liz Cheney, including Adam Kinzinger, and a bunch of others. And I'm sad to see you go. I think that we would have benefited from having you on this committee. And of course, it wasn't our decision that you not serve on the committee. That the speaker did say that she didn't want people who were material witnesses and possible participants in some of the coup and insurrectionary conduct to be on the committee. And obviously, we're not going to resolve our differences about that. But the decision to boycott the committee was not hers. That was made by the leader of your caucus. I have to say, because, Mr. Jordan is a very able man, but he oftentimes polarizes things. And I think the fact that we haven't just engaged in mutual polemics and diatribes has allowed us to make real progress on the committee. And I think it has been a bipartisan sentiment in the country that the committee has really stuck to the facts and told a compelling, fact-based narrative. And I hope that Congress can learn from that. Imagine if we could do hearings like this about climate change or gun violence or inflation or whatever it is. We don't have to agree on the final recommendations, but we can tell a powerful story to the country based on expert testimony and witnesses and facts rather than just mutual recrimination and insults to each other, because that kind of ad hominem politics is a bad example of the country, and everybody turns it off anyway. Ms. Law.
Just an observation, without getting into the many things that have been said here today, but the House Administration Committee, I think, is the smallest in the Congress. And this has been true whether the Republicans are in the majority or the Democrats in the majority. There's 6 majority members, and there are 3 minority members. The January 6th committee isn't that far off in terms of the split. We have 7 majority members and 2 minority members. So it's not, that dramatically different in terms of partisan split than the House Administration Committee. Just a thought that I've considered often, and I thank the gentleman.
Can I offer
Please, by all
thought?
means.
Can I offer a thought real quick?
Please.
That's exactly why I would have hoped that we would have run this investigation through the existing Committee on House Administration. I think it would have been much different, much more effective.
All right, that's all I got, and I yield back. Thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you. Chair Lofgren, thank you for your work to craft these bipartisan reforms to the presidential electoral college process. After all the events that have transpired after the past 2 years, there's urgency to reform the Electoral College Act to prevent bad actors of any party from using it to subvert our electoral process. We came way too close to having a constitutional crisis of existential proportions, and we're fortunate that the election officials of integrity, whether Republican, Democrat, or independent, diligently performed their duties in the face of the anti-democratic demands of the former president and his supporters. It's shocking that the constitutional ceremony on January 6th was weaponized to become an opportunity to manipulate the outcome of a free and fair election. To those who claim there's been insufficient committee work on this issue, I would refer them to the extensive work of the House Administration Committee and the January 6th Committee, as Chairwoman Lofgren just outlined, as well as the events that every member of the 117th Congress experienced on January 6th and 7th, 2021. We're all aware of the devastating series of events that took place between Election Day 2020 and the counting of the electoral votes. But as the January 6th Select Committee has shown, there was a clear, coordinated attempt by the disgraced former president to steal the 2020 election. And those events led his supporters to attack and harass election officials, protest outside of election facilities, and ultimately attack the Capitol and those who serve in it. I want to be clear, I don't believe that the law needs to be reformed because there are legitimate questions about what's currently allowed under the Electoral Count Act. But given the efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election, I do think it's necessary to forestall future bad faith efforts to advance radical, partisan, or even criminal interpretations of the law. The record here speaks for itself. We need to ensure that our federal elections are insulated from anti-democratic forces that have been encouraged by leaders who ought to know better. This bill will help protect the choices made by voters from both the whims of partisan officials and attempts to change electoral results with mob violence. And in doing so, those reforms will protect the country from going through another January 6th. So I look forward to passing the Presidential Election Reform Act in the House and then working with our Senate colleagues on a path forward for election reform. Chairwoman Lofgren, as you may be aware, the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania has been identified as a point person in the former president's plot to submit fake electors from Pennsylvania to Congress. And he has indicated that if elected, he intends to appoint a Secretary of State who might block certification of Pennsylvania's votes if, as governor, he disagrees with the voters' choice. So is there anything else you would like to add to your previous testimony on this or other topics?
Well, as I said in a prior answer, if this becomes law, he would not be able to do that. There would be a quick litigation. The courts would order him to transmit the certificate. If he refused to do so, they could order another officer to do that. And whoever it's for, I mean, Republican or Democrat, it's the voters who need to decide, not elected officials who are disappointed at the outcome. That's not the way it's supposed to work.
Thank you. I mean, it's a topic that's top of mind as we go through the elections this cycle in Pennsylvania because we are hearing these anti-democratic statements from the people who seek to hold office.
I would just note on the objections, and I think one of the members mentioned it, the research we've done indicates that with this standard, none of the objections made in the last 100 years could even be made because they're not grounded in the Constitution.
Well, and that's, obviously, as we saw on January 6th, Pennsylvania was one of the two states that were maliciously and without factual basis held up to not have the votes certified. And most distressingly, those folks who were sworn in on the same ballots 3 days prior and then voted against affirming those ballots in the president's race, I continue to find that impossible to stomach. But thank you for your work on this, and I yield back.
Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to Chair Lofgren for your great work here. I've said this before on different bills before the committee, and I think it bears repeating, that the need to do what we're doing today is really necessitated by the abnormal behavior of the previous president. Things that we have taken as articles of faith in American governance, in some cases for centuries, now have to be protected against because that behavior, which everyone accepted, the peaceful transfer of power, the recognition of the need to certify the Electoral College, the power of the vice president of this, because they've all been shattered. And so it necessitates Congress looking at these things anew and trying to put more guardrails in place for something that was accepted for centuries. And I think, in my view, and I have the highest regard for Mr. Davis, and am joined with my colleagues in indicating how sorry I am that he won't be in the next Congress because I think his voice is a needed voice. But I would have a hard time, Mr. Davis, I'm not going to lie, explaining what your objections are to the bill. and I won't ask you to regurgitate it again, but it feels like looking for ways to make an argument over things that should be patently obvious. We need to make the adjustments because the things that have stood the test of time for administration after administration after administration, election after election after election, were thrown into chaos, and we all witnessed it. 30-plus lawsuits, all attempting to demonstrate there was evidence of fraud, all dismissed. No evidence of any fraud widespread anywhere in this country was ever identified, and yet we have 30% of Americans now questioning whether or not the 2020 election was legitimate, with no evidence of it. Reminds me of kids when we would say about a purple elephant. Somebody'd say, well, there's no such thing as a purple elephant. And someone saying, how do you know? Have you ever seen one? It's kind of the same thing. There's no evidence for this, but we keep suggesting that it exists. So as I look at this, and again, I always say, look, you could write bills 1,000 different ways. I'm not saying it would be better or worse, but you could find alternative ways to do it, I suppose. But reaffirm that the vice president's role at the count is ministerial. I'm shocked that we even have to put that in statute. I mean, that seems patently obvious, but here we are, by virtue of what happened on January 6, 2021, doing what should be obvious to all of us, and frankly, I think would be obvious to all Americans. Making certain that we have a process to have a single accurate certificate from each state and designing how that should be done. Seems to me, again, lays out a process. Could you find other ways of doing it? Maybe. But this is an incredibly thoughtful way of doing this, and I compliment the chair and all those who contributed to this in trying to make sure that while there may always be disputes, I guess that's going to be now part of the terrain in American governments and American politics, is to object. This sets forth a process. I do have one suggestion that I might say to the chair if this gets negotiated between the Senate and the House. I don't think the state laws as they exist on election, I'm not sure what prior to election day, I think it should be 30 to 60 or 180 days prior to election day. I think the laws ought to be so that voters, even when they're going through early voting, they know that there's no chance there's going to be a change in the process. So I might just make that slight suggestion. I don't think asking 90 days would pick the number, but I think it needs to be at least a couple of months prior to the election when you're going through the process. Voters need to know what's the process for selecting electors in our state when they go to the polls. That is one suggestion I might make. Catastrophic events, I appreciate the fact that you've identified and defined what that process is. I was in New York City on September 11, 2001, which was the New York City elections. We had to go to state courts early that morning when the towers were struck, put off that election. But we were kind of making it up as we went. But you could see if that happened on Election Day in America, in a particular state, it would have caused enormous chaos. We would not have been able to, frankly, hold any kind of election. We didn't. And so setting forth the process makes a great deal of sense to me, and I congratulate you for doing that. And I would just close with this, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to belabor what other people have said far more eloquently than I have said, but it strikes me still when you have article after article appearing in news media about the reluctance of Republican candidates for governor or to the United States Senate. I'm not sure how many House candidates, if they've even been queried on this, who refuse to say today that they will accept the results of an election that's being held in 7 weeks. That this has become, respectfully, of my colleagues here, but it has become now one of the central themes of Republican candidates is to deny election results unless they turn out the way you want them to turn out. It is fundamentally, forget about destabilizing, this is eroding the foundation of everything we believe in as Americans, that we believe in electoral process, that we believe in fair elections, that we will all commit to this. And yet we have candidates after candidate after candidate saying, and I'd close with this, to me, the way I read this, this doesn't give a partisan advantage to the Democratic Party. I don't see anywhere in here that setting the rules for the determination of how your electors will be chosen prior to Election Day benefits anyone. It shouldn't. The whole point of this is to make this fair and make it transparent. And in the fact that there's such an objection to it makes me wonder whether or not this acknowledgement by our friends on the other side of the aisle that, in fact, they intend to exploit the rules. Because there could be nothing that you could, I would challenge anyone to tell me how they know by writing this or passing this benefits Democratic candidates. There is no way to make that argument in my mind. But I've spoken too long, and Madam Chair, I appreciate the indulgence and yield back.
Ms. Ross?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to congratulate Chair Lofgren and also Congresswoman Cheney on this bill. I'm glad that we're going to be passing it before the election, and I hope that the Senate takes it up in time for this election because it's something that's on the voters' minds. And I hear from voters every day. What are you doing to make sure that we do not have a situation like we did on January 6th? And in order to ensure the integrity of our republic, it's paramount that our election system functions to reflect the will of the people. On January 6th, we witnessed concerted efforts to undermine our democracy and overturn the results of a free and fair election. Thankfully, our democratic process prevailed, and Joe Biden was duly sworn in as the President of the United States. However, instigators of the insurrection and their allies continue to search for ways to undermine voters and their rights at the ballot box. This includes attempts to allow electors and state legislatures to discount election results. These efforts fly in the face of our nation's founding values. We are a representative democracy, and in fulfilling our duty to the citizens, our system must honor the will of the people. This is why the Presidential Election Reform Act is so critical. This legislation would establish that elected officials, including the Vice President, have no authority to reject the official state electoral slates or delay the counting of votes. Furthermore, it would limit members of Congress to only objecting to election results on constitutional grounds, not just partisan whims. Ensuring the integrity of our electoral process is essential to safeguarding our democracy. I urge my colleagues to support the underlying legislation. I support the rule, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, first let me say thank you to Chairwoman Lofgren and to Ranking Member Davis for being here, and in particular Chair Lofgren and to Representative Cheney as well for their leadership in crafting what I think is a very reasonable proposal that warrants the attention and ultimately, I think, the support of those of us here in the Congress. I know more about the Electoral Count Act of 1887 than I'd care to, I suppose. I spent a great deal of my Christmas break in 2020 studying this bill, or rather this statute, I should say, with Chairwoman Lofgren, with Mr. Raskin, and Mr. Schiff in preparing the defense of the Electoral College certification results that we would be engaged in those proceedings on January 6th. And like you, Mr. Davis, I was on the floor that day helping with Ms. Lofgren and Mr. Raskin and Mr. Schiff defend the Electoral College results, and but for the period of time in which we were evacuated off the floor, was there from the moment it started until 4 a.m. With you. I remember that very well, and with the Vice President. I remember shaking his hand as I walked off the floor to thank him for the role that he had played in ensuring that we did our job and vindicated the Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power, which has been a bedrock principle for the better part of the last 230 years in our republic, would be sustained. But I have to say, and I would echo the comments made by Mr. Morelli, I'm a bit confused by some of the objections that have been raised by my colleagues on the other side. I understand the points that Ranking Member Davis has made, and of course I respect him a great deal and have enjoyed serving with him, and I echo the sentiments of my colleagues. I think we're going to miss your service here in the House. I understand the process arguments that you're making, but substantively, I don't understand the objections to this particular piece of legislation. Simply because we were able to ultimately do our job after a violent mob attacked our Capitol does not mean that we should ignore the real deficiencies within the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Our great fear, certainly my great fear, and I believe many of my colleagues shared it at that time, was that the law would be weaponized, because it is so archaic and nebulous in some places, by more nefarious actors to try to ultimately subvert the results of a free and fair election. And that is exactly what was attempted, or rather what some folks attempted to do. I am grateful they didn't succeed, but they came awfully close. So us taking these reforms up and considering them thoughtfully, which I think we are doing here in the Rules Committee, and I imagine we'll do on the floor tomorrow, and then engaging with our colleagues in the Senate as they take up their legislation that they've introduced, I think is crucially important for all of the reasons that Representative Ross and so many others have articulated in terms of defending our republic, our ability to function as a constitutional republic. I do have to say I find it very rich indeed for my colleague, he stepped away from Texas, the good doctor, as he entered into the record the list of members who have objected apparently in 2004. That's long before my time here in the House. But I don't think that his recollection of the historical record is completely accurate. Because as I look back over the modern history of our country, George H.W. Bush, when he was elected in 1988, there wasn't a single member of the United States Senate, Democrat or Republican, who would sustain an objection during the electoral count certification process. In 2000, yes, were many members, I believe 19 or 20 members of the House, who ultimately attempted to make objections. But not a single Democratic senator would sustain that objection in 2000. And George W. Bush was declared the president. In 2016, we're going to talk about 2004. In 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, there were a few members of the House, yes, who attempted to make objections. Mr. Davis, was there a single Democratic senator who sustained the objections in 2016?
Mr. Goose, thank you.
Or am I wrong?
No, thank you for the question.
And I'm going to talk about 2004,
Yeah,
so don't
that's
don't worry
great.
about it.
I'll leave 2004 out of it. I'll talk about 2017. I was there.
Sure.
It was actually the first Electoral College certification process I've been through. I went back home during the 2013 one, so I didn't witness it. I came here thinking it was a ceremonial process. And you know what? I was a little surprised when I saw some of my colleagues object to Alabama, object to Florida. And I'm going to attribute the vice president at the time, our now President Biden, for a comment he made that I thought was a very, very good way to shoot down any of these possible objections. And I don't know who he said it with, but it was, it's over, man. You know what? Vice President Pence did that through the processes that worked on January 6th, too. Except, as you're going to mention, like 04, and I believe, unfortunately, on January 6th also, but like 04, there was a Senate objector.
Correct.
And I don't believe, unless some of my colleagues in the room can tell me, that it's not through a lack of effort in 2017 that there was no Senate objector, but the process worked every time. And I'm not going to defend the mob that attacked this institution. No one is.
No one's suggesting that, Mr. Davis.
We have got to make sure that before we change processes that have worked, that there's bipartisan consultation. I'm glad to hear Chairperson Lofgren talk about a conference committee, because if that's the case, I certainly can't wait to serve on it.
Giving you an opportunity, I want to reclaim my time for just a moment, and then I'm going to give Chair Lofgren an opportunity to respond. So just to clarify, in 2016, there was not a single Democratic or Republican senator who ultimately would sustain the objections to the Electoral College certification that ultimately culminated in Donald Trump becoming President of the United States.
I answered that, right?
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
All right.
My point is this, and it's not, Mr. Davis, you and I subscribe to the same philosophy as it relates to the Electoral College certification. My objection is being lectured by my colleague from Texas, who voted to object to certify to the 2020 presidential election results, along with 137 of his colleagues, including every Republican member of the Rules Committee, and regaling us with tales of 29 people who voted against the objections in 2004. You're not wrong. I hear what you're saying, and you're right. In 2004, there was a Democratic senator who ultimately sustained that objection, right? In 2020, you had 7 with respect to Pennsylvania, 6 with respect to Arizona in the United States Senate. It is clear the march is on. This process is now becoming a far more politicized process than it had been really for the bulk of American history. And so from my perspective, these reforms, in particular the 2 substantive reforms that are included within this bill, the acknowledgement, which is in effect a restatement of existing law, that the vice president's role is purely ministerial, as Representative Morelli touched upon, and 2, the raising of the threshold, which in my view is critical. The notion that now an objection will not be sustained without at least a third of each body registering that objection. Then, of course, the clarifications constitutionally as to what would be a lawful, cogent objection under this new statute. I think those reforms are sorely needed and will ultimately return this Electoral College certification proceeding back to the way in which it was understood by our predecessors in the Congress in 1886 and 1887 when they first enacted the statute, and I think more consistently with what the framers and the founders of our great country had in mind. I want to give Chairwoman Lofgren an opportunity to the extent that she wanted to.
Just briefly, I think it's important that it be clarified that the vice president has no role, it's ministerial, not because it's a change from what the law is today, but because that was weaponized by the former president. He said at the speech, we don't hope that Mike Pence doesn't let us down, that he has the power to turn this around. That was never true, but it was exploited, and an armed mob believed that it was true and marched to the Capitol to overturn the results, to get the vice president to overturn the election. So if we make this even more clear, because they attempted to violate the 25th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act, it will be helpful. It's worth reiterating, what does the 12th Amendment say? It says the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. That's it. And this has historically been the case. In 1800, only a decade after the Constitution was ratified, both houses passed versions of a bill to reform the electoral counting process, but there was no role for the vice president. 1805, Vice President Burr explicitly recognized Congress's constitutional authority to count electoral votes when he directed the congressional tellers to count the votes as the Constitution and laws direct. 1825, a bill introduced by future President Martin Van Buren also rejected any substantive role for the vice president. President Lincoln declared that the 2 houses of Congress convened under the 12th Amendment have complete power to count the electoral votes. There's no basis for the vice president. As you and I both know, and I remember Mr. Raskin, you and I studying this in preparation for January 6th. I do think it's important that if there are objections, they be defined to be only those that are listed in the Constitution themselves, and those are very narrow. It would be whether an elector voted for 2 candidates from the elector's own state in violation of the 12th Amendment. None of the objections raised would have met that threshold in the last, ever.
Correct.
So this will provide not a change in the law, not a change in the Constitution, but protection from those who would try and mislead people to the detriment of our democracy. And that's why I think it's important that we pass the bill. Mr. Morell, I took your comment on the timing of the election. The other side that we heard from as we Ms. Cheney and I crafted this bill was designed not to intrude on the state's capacity to run their own elections. And that's the countervailing pushback from the conservative scholars that we consulted. But the point is, you know, throughout the Constitution, voting is enshrined. And nowhere does it say, as a matter of fact, we even have in the Constitution, each state is entitled to a Republican form of government. It's not provided in the Constitution that a governor can decide the vote. It's the voters who decide who's going to be the president.
If I might add or ask one question to you, Mr. Davis, if you might be willing to just opine on those two particular changes that I noted. So the increasing the threshold, and then we don't use the word clarifying, but essentially restating, I think, the principle that we all collectively agree upon, which is that the vice president's role is ministerial, and your thoughts on those two particular changes.
This is why I wish we would have been consulted on the front end before I even came to this meeting. I mean, we agree on process. And look, I'm batting 1,000 here on process since I've been coming to this Rules Committee over the last few Congresses. And I'm 0 for whatever number of times that I've been here arguing our side. Unfortunately, this is a majority-driven institution. There's a distinct reason that there are that many members of the majority party on rules and that many members of the minority party on rules. I said all along, and I've made public comments about the fact that the vice president, in my opinion, my interpretation of the 12th Amendment is completely ceremonial. I think Mike Pence is very courageous. I think Mike Pence did his job. I think Joe Biden did his job in 2017. Listen, objections have happened. The process of objecting to the Electoral College slates from states is nothing new, even to people in this room who have done that. Was that the beginning of creating a lack of faith in our elections? I mean, I got page after page after page of partisans on your side denying and objecting to elections. Look, Joe, I agree with you. There are many candidates across this great nation in my party right now that should answer that question much differently. But then why is the DCCC funding fringe candidates like that to win primaries? I mean, at some point, this is an overarching problem that exists way outside of this Capitol building that we can't ignore sitting in here. So if we want to have faith in our elections, let's work together. I wasn't given that opportunity once again. And it's not because I don't have a record of working with the other side in my time here in Congress. I appreciate that. But in the end, there are some provisions in here that I object to, and I mentioned those, the 5-day provision, having a loser be able to object after unofficial results are in. Those are things that I think could have been addressed if we would have sat down in a mature bipartisan way.
Just to put a finer point on it, so, but I hear you. I hear what you're saying about the process. I'm not on the House Administration Committee, but in terms of increasing the threshold, I'm just legitimately interested in your thoughts as the ranking member and as someone who has also studied this issue. If you think the threshold increase makes sense.
I am glad to hear, sir, that you are interested in my thoughts. I am.
I'm not so sure. I don't know if
Ed, there's one. Oh.
I'm going to run out of time here from, and I know
there is no time.
I know, I hear you, but I still may very well run out of time. So do you agree, disagree?
These are issues that I think we can address we can address those issues based upon the debate we're having today. Let's see how this process and the rule that's going to be put forth is completed. And I'm going to make sure that if what Chairperson Loughran said, that there's a commitment from this majority, and I certainly hope it's the case. I'm not going to hold my breath if it's not, because I've been here long enough to know that may be the case. If there is a conference committee, I certainly hope to be on that conference committee. I certainly hope that if it has House administration jurisdiction, I would be one of the leaders of that conference committee on our side. I am not going to commit to support or not support any provision in any bill that I may be able to then negotiate later, because I certainly believe, and I hope you believe, that if you put me around that table, I'm going to work to get the best bipartisan solution we can.
Fair enough. Well, I would, Chair Loughran.
We selected 1/3, and I thought it was a reasonable amount, but to some extent, it's an arbitrary number. Now, in talking to Senator Blunt, they had a formula that they had in mind, that they have a smaller number. Maybe they're right, I don't know. So I think we need to have some further discussion with the Senate on that point, and I'm sure that will be productive.
Well, again, thank you to Chair Lofgren. I think these reforms are sorely needed, as I said, and I certainly hope, I have great respect for the ranking member and have enjoyed working with him, so I do hope that he'll consider, as the bill works its way through the House and as we ascertain what the Senate might accomplish in the coming months as well, that we'll be able to get to a product that can get to the president's desk, because I do think these reforms are needed. And I think you should take great pride in your vote to certify the election in 2020. And I've said that to many of my other Republican colleagues who took the same stance that you did, many of whom have paid a pretty heavy political price. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Perlmutter.
I heard the chair's tone, and I heard the ranking member join him. So mine are more nuts and bolts questions, because I agree with Mr. Davis. In this instance, I think we want to have fewer moving parts, not more moving parts. We want to have fewer points of contention, not more points of contention. So that's, Ms. Lofgren, I'm going to have some questions after I've studied this a little bit more. Because no question, this needs to be addressed. And, I mean, it goes into if only the president, vice president, candidates can object. At the state level, goes to the U.S. District Court. There's a three-judge panel. Three-judge panel makes a determination. Either the governor goes along, doesn't go along, somebody's picked. If the governor doesn't go along, eventually something's transmitted to the archivist. The archivist then takes control. The archivist then transmits to the Congress. The archivist can be sued or not sued. The courts play a big role in this thing, and obviously that they always have. Goes here, then once it's here, somebody can object if they have a third of the members joining them, not just as today, it would be one senator joining them. And they are, I guess that is my one question. So it says, the member, the objection, let's see.
Mr. Perlmutter, the governor to the archivist is existing law. That's not new.
Okay, so, but there's a provision in here that says the archivist can be sued on the transmission of the, they didn't transmit the right thing, I guess. I don't know. I mean, it may be the same. I'm not, just so long as we're not having more parts. This is my question. It's more on what a member can do. So let's say you get you get a third of the House to join you. A motion pursuant, motions in order at joint session. No motion shall be received in the joint session except a motion pursuant to subsection B of this section in relation to the appointment of the electors, or B, a motion to recess. So the only question I have, what could I, and who is it? The parliamentarian that's going to say I've done a motion that's out of order and not to be accepted, and then the ruling of the chair could be appealed at that point? Is that how you see this working?
Well, you would have to have grounds that are grounded in the 12th Amendment. And that's the only thing that would be appropriate for, at that point, for a grounds to be heard. The whole, if you think about, and we had a long discussion about this and reached out to the professors and the judges and the like. Right now, we have the Congress that's playing or trying to play a role that's really not envisioned in the Constitution. But if there is a dispute, let's say, make anything up in your mind about the conduct of an election. People want that to be challenged. I believe that the courts are much better suited to reaching a conclusion than the Congress is at this point. And I think that was displayed quite importantly on January 6th. I will say, there's a lot of judges that were appointed by the former president who I didn't agree, I didn't think they were great appointments, but all of the judges played it straight on all of the cases. And so if you're going to look at which branch are we going to look to make sure that this is on the up and up, I think it's the judicial branch that we look to. And that's why you front load these challenges. You go to the district court, you get it decided, and then really all that remains is for the Congress, then the vote shall be counted.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Anybody else have any questions? If not, I thank the panel for being here. It's great to see you both, and you can go. Are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 8873? Seeing none, this closes the hearing. And at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 8873, the Presidential Election Reform Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on House Administration or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
You heard the motion from the gentleman. Any discussion or amendment? Anybody? No? If not, then the vote is on the motion of the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres. Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross. Aye. Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschteller. Mr. Reschteller, no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Mr. Raskin will carry it for the Democrats.
We'll put our own skilled lawyer on the floor, Mr. Reschenthaler. We'll have another wonderful duel.
And Mr. Reschenthaler for the opposed. Thank you very much. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Just don't give him any clean water.